I mean, well, Sam will tell you he was one of the biggest sellers on the label. He'll tell you that all the time. But to give him credit, he was coming off of VOA. It was his biggest album.
Right.
He had a big hit. He was one of the bigger sellers on Geffen, absolutely.
Yeah.
So why would David Geffen just be like, okay, yeah, goodbye, and give that away?
Doesn't make any sense.
David Geffen wasn't an idiot, so he negotiated his terms of release.
Absolutely. So now also in regards to Eat 'Em and Smile, now Ted started getting into the band. Once they built the band up with Billy Sheehan and Steve Vai and Greg Bissonette, he says the album we'd make could never match a Van Halen album by the original four guys, but I wanted to try to get as close as we could. And the album was loud and leering and fun and ferocious. And it was more than the synth-heavy stuff Ed was doing. He explains why there's such incredible high energy on that album. And he talks about Shy Boy, which he decided was a standout on the album and was the closest to Van Halen. And he says, I heard later that when Eddie first listened to Shy Boy, especially that insane ending Billy and Steve put together, he got upset because it was so over-the-top, technically brilliant, that he interpreted as a personal challenge to him. I thought that was really interesting to hear. What do you think?
That song, and definitely that ending, is one of the high points of the album.
Oh, totally.
I mean, it really just accentuates the kind of bass playing that Billy Sheehan brought to the table that, quite frankly, wasn't on a Van Halen album before.
Right.
So it's no wonder that Ed felt threatened. And, the thing is that, after Crazy from the Heat, I know maybe everybody thought Dave was going to be like, let's make another Bozy Bop, City Bop album. And Dave did not do that. I mean, they had worked on a bunch of songs for the movie, and then the movie didn't pan out. Right. And then they went back into the studio and said, all right, well, let's do a few more songs.
Right.
I have enough songs for the album. Right. And like you said, I mean, there's a lot of songs on that album that rock hard. And Dave recognized that. And Ted, when he came in there, I mean, he made sure that, he was following old school Van Halen practices by, making it sound as live as he could. And, Steve Vai would have loved to, overdub stuff and redo it again and again. And, and much to Steve's frustration, Ted was having none of that.
Right.
But, I mean, the proof is in the pudding. It's still a rockin' album to this day.
Absolutely. And he talked about, That's Life. He said he didn't think it was the greatest performance for Dave, but he said it was full of bravado, enthusiasm, and personality. And he said Ladies' Night in Buffalo was one of the highlights of his career. He thought that Dave really nailed it on that song, which is fantastic. And he said the whole album possessed a real Van Halen spirit. And then in the midst of all this, while making everything, Ed had called on Ted Templeman to sequence 5150 album, and he met with Don and Ed, and I didn't quite understand why he went to Ted to do that. Didn't you find that an odd moment in the book?
Why do you find that odd?
Why would he need Ted to sequence the album? That doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think they were still trying to get Ted to be involved with the album somewhat, and I guess they had never done that themselves before.
What does it take?
And, that was always Ted's thing. And Ted admits earlier in the book that he would go to the bitter end to sequence an album. I mean, I think he says, for some of the earlier Van Halen albums, if you look at the back cover of the vinyl albums, like the sequence on the back is not really the sequence on the album because they had approved the artwork already, but Ted was still fussing around with it till the very end. Yeah. I forget which albums it was. Oh, you know what it was? It was Fair Warning, and it was Diver Down. I mean, these days you can do any sequence you want, so to people today, they're probably like, well, what's the big deal? Who cares? But back then, it was what it was.
Right.
But I guess they liked the way that Ted did it. But, they just couldn't let it go. I mean, the funny part was they had a producer. They had Mick Jones.
Yeah.
They were not involving him.
No.
It's like a shake your head kind of moment.
That's for sure. So now here's the other funny thing is he says that Eat 'Em and Smile is sonically better than 5150. He says 5150, though he doesn't really talk about the album much, he just says it wasn't to my taste. But then he also said that David Lee Roth had success but didn't deliver the commercial benefit to Warner Brothers. But he was incredibly surprised by plugging Sammy into Van Halen, and the band still remains huge and a big selling act without Dave. Dave was committed to hard, heavy rock, and that was more in the Van Halen style. But he kept hoping for a reconciliation to try to get Van Halen back together, which I thought was nuts. I can't believe that he really thought, even after 5150 and the success they had with Sam, that Dave was still going to come back to the band. Didn't you find that strange?
Yeah, I mean, especially because Van Halen, they didn't do any videos. They started the tour. The album hadn't come out yet. They have a new manager. They've got a new producer. I mean, they've got everything stacked against them. And they come out with a number one album, and they knock it out of the park. And all the press they're doing is, hey, we're buddy-buddy with Sam. We love Sam. And you think, like, after that the band is going to be like, we're done now. We're going to go back to Dave. I mean, I guess Ted had really underestimated how well the album was going to do, how well they were going to get along with Sam, and that it was just going to be this big love fest for the next decade.
Yeah, totally. He kept saying here, so now this is another weird turn to the book. He talked about he produced Done with Mirrors for Aerosmith, and he was about to do the next Aerosmith album, which ended up being Permanent Vacation, which was done by Bruce Fairbairn, producer of the Balanced album, which we celebrated last month for the 25th anniversary. The interesting thing was, he was going to do the next Aerosmith album, but Dave said he was ready to do his next solo album. So he said, all right, so you're going to be ready to go in the studio? He says, yes. So he kind of gave up the job of producing the next Aerosmith album so he could work on Dave's second solo album, or third if you count the EP, I don't know, whatever. The second one, the one following Eat 'Em and Smile. But Dave ends up firing Ted, and he goes into the detail about how Dave hosts a meeting, and he goes to Dave's office, and Dave sits behind a desk and fires him, and he said it was like getting his pocket picked of $1 million, and he says, I was so pissed at Dave for firing me, but more than anything else, the way he did it pissed me off. Here he is behind a desk, terminating me like I was a guy who had done a bad job painting his house. He was a prick about it, and he was mad that he lost the Aerosmith job, but he says that Dave did that as a competitive move so that he wouldn't be producing Aerosmith and he could knock that out of the way. But he says Dave wasn't even thankful for all he had done for his career, but he was more mad about losing the Aerosmith job. Then they go into the whole thing about, he goes back to 5150 in 1991. This is strange. Ed calls him up and says, Ted, can you come in and crack the whip? Now, what the hell was going on? They had already had a success at 5150. They had already had a success with OU812. They're on their third album with Sammy for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. It was being produced by Andy Johns, who produced Led Zeppelin and the Stones. And then they're having problems, and Ed calls up Ted and says, Ted, can you come in and crack the whip? Well, Ted Templeman said, Ed's a brilliant creative guy, but he was never very organized or focused on deadlines. And when Ed ran into a jam, he'd call me because he knew he could count on me. And there's even a part of the book, and this was also another dark turn, where Ed gets into a physical altercation with Valerie's father, I believe it is, and Ed ends up getting his face punched in and having to go to the hospital, and Valerie calls Ted to take care of the situation, right, Dave? Wasn't that weird?
Yeah, I don't like what. Yeah. That's weird that she's calling up Ted.
It was just bizarre.
I guess nobody else was home. I mean, I don't know.
I don't know, man.
I don't know what happened, but yeah, I mean, Andy Johns. Brilliant producer, would never take away anything from him in terms of the sound he was getting for the band. But, apparently, which is shocking because he's like a major producer.
Totally.
So, like, what is happening? Yeah. What is happening at 5150?
Right, exactly.
That they're so far behind that they can't get an album. Admittedly, like my impression has always been if it was up to Ed, he would just be, noodling all day, la 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 la. Yeah. And okay, you need somebody to get things done.
Totally.
But that's Andy's job.
Right.
So why can't he do it? So, and I know that Ted joined when the album was already much of the way through.
Right.
But I really don't think it's a coincidence that Van Halen's most rocking album with Sam is also one that Ted is involved with.
Absolutely, and it was also
involved
injured,
with. I don't think.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a coincidence at all.
And also what was revealed in the book was that when things really broke down with Andy Johns is apparently he completely erased one of Sammy's great vocal tracks. And Sammy lost his shit.
And I think that's when they start. Because now you're right, because I think Sam was like, that's it, I'm done. Right. I'm not working with you anymore.
Yeah, he's like, oh, fuck this.
Right, and I think that's when Ed called Ted.
Yeah.
Because at least Sam had worked with Ted before, and Eddie knew he would work with him, and that's how they that's how they got the album done.
Absolutely, and there's a line here from Ted that says, "You could drag Sammy out of bed, put a mic in front of his face, and he'd give you killer stuff." That's how talented he is. He's saying that you could literally do that with Sammy. But Sammy was mad. And then Andy Johns was pissed that they brought Ted in. Now, Ted's not only a high-level producer, he's a high-level executive at the label that's putting out the album. And Andy Johns starts abusing Ted. He was unhinged, apparently, and he spat at him. Ted described him as a giant grizzly bear who was confrontational and gruff, and he thought Ed loved him and Al just wanted those sound of the John Bonham drums. But Andy was insulted that they brought in Ted, and Sammy was mad that Andy erased his vocals, and it was all getting crazy. He ended up giving Andy money, $25,000, to help him with his bills, and I don't know, man. This was crazy. And then he did talk about how he loved Spanked, the song Spanked. This is why I keep saying how strange it is. Certain songs he just falls in love with that you don't expect, but he talked about how Spanked and how much he loved it, and he loved Sammy's upbeat lyrics on Top of the World. But I do think you have a point there why that album sounds so rockin'. I will also say Balance is rockin' too. There's some really good stuff on Balance. And like I said in our last cast, that's an album definitely worth revisiting because there's some good stuff there. There's some big reason why that album is so good. I mean, Andy Johns, too. I mean, Andy Johns is an incredible producer, but apparently he had some substance abuse problems, mixed with Ed's substance abuse problems, mixed with Ed's not great time organizing skills. Sammy getting pissed off, and then it becomes a whole big mess, and who had to come in but Uncle Ted come in there and clean everything up. But it really just showed you the father figure role he had on Van Halen from the very beginning when he took them under his wing when they were young men, and also all the way up until 1991. I mean, he's overseeing them. Funny enough, though, doesn't talk about Skyscraper, what he thought of it, the direction of that band, this and that. Doesn't get into that. Doesn't really criticize anything about OU812 and all that stuff. No one mentions what the hell happened to Don Landy after OU812. I mean, what happened to Don Landy? He just disappeared off the face of the earth after OU812. He was on every Van Halen album, and then he's gone. What the hell happened there? No one knows the answer to that question.
No, and it was really interesting because in Ted's book, he said, in addition to complimenting Michael Anthony all the time, he did say that Don knew how to record bass players. And specifically, he knew how to record Michael Anthony and get the most out of them, which really makes you wonder, then what the heck happened on OU812 when there's no bass sound?
Right.
And Don's supposed to know how to record bass players.
Right.
So I guess, that's a piece of the puzzle.
Right. And that basically wraps up the whole Van Halen portion of the book. There's obviously so much more of the book left, but it's definitely worth getting. It's definitely worth reading. Greg does a fantastic job putting it all together. I can imagine it. No wonder it took him so long. There's just so much in there. God knows what he had to cut out, but you really got a nice perspective of what was going on surrounding the album and all the psyche around the album. And you get a lot of detail on the first album, a lot of detail on 1984, a lot of detail on the Crazy from the Heat transitional 5150 era stuff from behind the scenes. Really interesting things. I was very satisfied with everything that was there. I would have expected maybe a little more on maybe some VOA or maybe a little more on Eat 'em and Smile, but I don't know. I thought it was just an interesting